There is a quiet kind of woman who doesn't ask, doesn't chase, doesn't plead, perform, or prove. She doesn't flirt with the world to earn her place in it. She doesn't shrink herself into sweetness. She doesn't beg to be needed. And because of that, she terrifies us. Not in the obvious way. Not in the way a tyrant or manipulator does. But in a subtler, more primal way. She threatens something deeper. Something we barely understand. We fear her because she represents the thing we cannot control, and more disturbingly, the thing we cannot rescue. She doesn't want to be saved. And if you can't save her, who are you? The fear begins in silence. In the pause after a man's offer is declined, with dignity, not drama. In the way she walks away without asking for closure. In the way she remains calm when you try to provoke her. We fear women who need nothing because they break a mirror. We didn't know we were staring into the mirror that reflects our ego, our usefulness, our identity as protectors, providers, performers. We are taught that a man must be needed to matter. But what happens when she doesn't need you? This fear is not just about gender. It runs deeper into the unconscious. Carl Jung once wrote that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. In many of us, there is an unlived life. A quiet grief about who we were not allowed to be. And often that unlived life haunts us through projection. When we meet someone who embodies the parts of ourselves, we never claimed we don't feel admiration. We feel threat. The woman who needs nothing evokes that shadow. She is the part of the feminine psyche that refused to be molded. She did not trade her wildness for belonging. She learned how to be alone without being lonely. She is mystery without apology. And this disturbs the parts of us that are still dependent on approval, still addicted to being needed to feel worthy. In the language of depth psychology, this woman symbolizes what Jung would call an individuated self, a person who has withdrawn their projections, confronted their complexes, and integrated the opposites within. She does not demand love. She does not seduce with desperation. Her stillness is her sovereignty, and for those who are still entangled in the need to be needed, she is unbearable. Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." But most of us don't live from our own why. We live in response. We live to maintain roles: boyfriend, fixer, savior, therapist, knight. We are taught to earn love by solving problems, by being useful, by making ourselves indispensable. But when we meet someone who doesn't need us to be useful, we panic. Because now we are naked. Now we have no function. And without a function, the ego collapses. The woman who needs nothing is not without feeling. She is not cold. She is simply not codependent. Her love is not a negotiation. Her presence is not a plea. She has boundaries, silence, standards. And still she holds softness, just not for sale. She evokes the terror of emotional self-responsibility, the kind of adulthood many never reach. She makes you confront the question, what is your worth when no one depends on you to feel whole? In relationships, this fear shows up as resentment. Passive aggression, accusations of being too independent, too distant, too proud. But these are projections, attempts to reframe her wholeness as a flaw, because it threatens our sense of superiority. If you have always defined your value by being the one who rescues, then a woman who refuses to be rescued will feel like a rejection of your identity. But it is not her rejection. It is your own emptiness being revealed. She did not reject you. She merely refused to collapse into need so that you could feel full. This fear is also ancient, evolutionary. In early human tribes, interdependence meant survival. We are wired to connect, to serve, to support. But this wiring becomes a trap when survival strategies turn into identity, when love becomes a transaction of need. And so when we meet someone who does not operate from that wiring, someone who can walk away without punishment, who can love without possession, we mislabel it as arrogance, when in truth it is freedom. But freedom for the unfree feels like violence. To those who are still enslaved to their emotional dependencies, the self-contained woman is unbearable. She doesn't play the game. She doesn't flatter egos. She doesn't bend into roles. And this shatters the fantasy we were raised on, that love is something you earn through sacrifice, suffering, and submission. That if you give enough, bleed enough, prove enough, you'll be chosen. But she doesn't need to be chosen. She has already chosen herself. And in that moment, we're not facing her. We're facing the unclaimed self within us, the part of us that also wants to stop performing, that wants to rest, that wants to belong to itself. But we've buried that part beneath years of people-pleasing and emotional labor. So when she arrives, she feels like a threat. But she is not the threat. She is the invitation. An invitation to ask, who are you when no one needs you? And can you still love yourself when love is not earned, but simply given? We fear women who need nothing not because they are cruel, but because they remind us of the emptiness we've hidden behind our usefulness. They are not the enemy. They are the mirror. There is a hidden contract between most men and women, never written, but deeply ingrained. It says, if you make me feel needed, I will offer you my strength. If you depend on me, I will protect you. But the woman who needs nothing voids this contract. She does not flatter the hero archetype in the man, and without that mirror, many men feel invisible. Jung believed the psyche is a self-regulating system, always balancing opposites, and the masculine psyche, if immature, needs the feminine to appear fragile so that it can feel strong. This is not love. It is compensation. And so when a woman emerges who has integrated her inner masculine, who can hold herself, defend herself, think for herself, the dynamic shatters. She doesn't need a protector. She wants a partner. And for those who have only ever known relationships through power imbalance, this is disorienting. There is a particular kind of man who unconsciously seeks out broken women. Not because he is cruel, but because he doesn't know how to feel worthy unless he is fixing something. He is not in love, he is in a role. He confuses being needed with being seen. So when he meets a woman who isn't broken, who doesn't need his therapy, his wallet, his guidance, or his validation, he feels useless. And rather than sit with that discomfort and ask why he needs to be needed, he may resent her. He may try to diminish her. He may call her cold masculine or emotionally unavailable. But the truth is, she simply does not orbit around his wound. She has her own axis. And for someone who has built his identity around being a savior, being irrelevant feels like death. This is not just about men. Women too fear the woman who needs nothing. She disrupts the social order. She breaks the cycle of feminine submission that was passed down in silence from mother to daughter, generation after generation. She is not polite about her boundaries. She is not ashamed of being alone. She does not degrade herself to be chosen. And because of that, many women project bitterness onto her. They call her selfish, arrogant, unnatural. They whisper that she's cold, secretly wounded, or in denial. But deep down, they're not angry at her. They're angry at the part of themselves that never dared to do what she did, to walk away from dependency, to speak without permission, to stop begging for love, and instead embody it. Adler, one of Freud's contemporaries, once wrote that all neurosis stems from a sense of inferiority and the compensations we build around it. The woman who needs nothing may be labeled as intimidating, But what she actually does is expose the compensations. She unmasks the roles. She makes us aware of how much of our identity is performance. Not truth, not being, just acting. And this awareness is painful, because it means everything we thought made us lovable, our sacrifices, our compromises, our compliance, was not love. It was fear. Fear of abandonment. Fear of rejection. Fear of being too much. Fear of being not enough. So we became what others needed. We became useful, desirable, impressive. But we did not become whole. To be whole is to not need to be needed in order to feel real. It is to know that your presence is enough without proving. The woman who needs nothing has often walked through fire to reach this truth. She has endured abandonment. She has grieved illusions. She has unlearned centuries of silence. And now she no longer confuses sacrifice with love. She no longer attaches her worth to being wanted. She is not playing the game of attraction. She is not manipulating energy to receive attention. She is simply herself, sovereign and intact. And this is what makes her radiant, not in the loud, performative way of attention-seeking, but in the quiet, magnetic way of someone who belongs to themselves. But with that radiance comes cost, because the world is not used to women who do not apologize. The world is not used to women who say no without explanation, who do not entertain insecurity, who do not participate in power plays. This woman is often misunderstood, feared, attacked, told she will end up alone. But solitude is not a threat to her. She has made peace with her aloneness. She has built a home inside herself. So when someone comes along, she does not cling. She does not need them to complete her. She chooses them. And that choice, unpressured, unneedy, unpossessive, is the purest form of love. Most people, however, cannot recognize love in this form, because they only understand love as possession, as merging, as losing yourself in the other. But she does not disappear in love. She expands, and she expects you to do the same. She does not want you to collapse for her. She wants you to rise beside her. And this is where many men falter, because they are not used to being loved by someone who does not need them. They do not know how to give love freely when it is not a transaction. They do not know how to hold their ground in the face of emotional sovereignty. And so they retreat, or they attack, or they label her difficult, when really they are afraid of being required to grow. To love a woman who needs nothing, you must have confronted your own emptiness. You must have held your own pain, your own shame, your own failures, without needing her to heal them. You must have gone through the death of the boy, the one who sought approval from women to feel whole, and emerged as a man who knows his worth without confirmation. Only then can you meet her eye to eye. Only then can you walk beside her without trying to pull her down or pedestal her. Only then can you see her not as a prize or a problem, but as a person. The woman who needs nothing is not asking you to disappear. She's asking you to appear without armor, without roles, without dependence. She is asking for presence, not performance. And that is terrifying, because most of us have never been taught how to simply be. We know how to chase, how to fix, how to seduce, how to sacrifice. But we do not know how to stand still whole within ourselves and simply share our being. This is why we fear her, not because she is cruel, but because she reminds us of what love could be if we were brave enough to stop performing. If we were willing to meet each other, not as halves searching for completion, but as wholes sharing clarity. She is not the end of love. She is its evolution. And until we evolve, we will continue to call her too much, too little, too independent, too cold anything, to avoid the truth. That it is not her that we cannot bear. It is ourselves in her presence. But we must be honest. It is not just fear that arises in her presence. It is grief. Grief for the lives we didn't live. Grief for the selves we abandoned. Grief for the years we spent chasing approval, believing love had to be earned through exhaustion. The woman who needs nothing awakens this grief simply by existing. She stands in a room and unmasks our compromises. She doesn't attack. She doesn't blame. She doesn't even speak it aloud. Her existence alone is enough to make the unconscious stir. We see in her what we lost in ourselves, and the realization is unbearable. We realize we traded authenticity for attachment. We realize we silenced our own voice to keep others comfortable. We realize we played roles so well we forgot we were acting. And suddenly, in the reflection of her wholeness, we can't look away from what we gave up in order to belong. Schopenhauer wrote that most human suffering comes not from what is, but from what we desire and cannot have. But sometimes suffering comes from what we see in others that reminds us of who we could have become. The woman who needs nothing becomes the embodiment of that possibility. She is the echo of our unlived courage, our unapologetic power, our unchained voice. And so, to protect ourselves from the shame of that awareness, we turn her into a threat. We attack what we envy. We vilify what we admire. We say she's lonely, bitter, too independent, a feminist cliché, anything to avoid seeing her clearly. Because to see her clearly would mean seeing our own surrender. And we are not ready for that. In mythology, there is often a sacred feminine archetype who cannot be possessed: Artemis, Lilith, Isis. These are not passive women waiting to be chosen. They are complete unto themselves. And in every era, they have been feared. Not because they caused harm, but because they represented sovereignty. The woman who needs nothing is the modern expression of this ancient archetype. She does not submit to the scripts. She does not shape herself for approval. She is in the deepest sense free, and freedom to those still enslaved by expectation looks like rebellion, looks like danger, looks like chaos. But it is not chaos. It is order, an inner order that does not depend on external permission to exist. Jung would describe this woman as one who has individuated, who has withdrawn projections, integrated shadow, and no longer seeks the mother or father in her partners. She has reparented herself. She has rescued herself. And because of that, she no longer enters relationships from a place of wounding. She doesn't need someone to fix her. She doesn't need to fix anyone else. She can walk away from drama because she no longer confuses pain with passion. She can stay single not because she's afraid of love, but because she has stopped calling dependency love. And this alone redefines everything we've been taught about connection. It demands a higher level of intimacy, one not built on emotional need, but on spiritual choice. This is the reason we fear her. She forces evolution. She exposes the immaturity in our understanding of love. She interrupts the fairy tale that says, "You will be saved by another." She asks instead that you save yourself, and then meet her on equal ground. That you come not as a rescuer, not as a child, not as a role, but as a self. This kind of love requires depth, patience, humility, and for most, that is too much. Because we have grown comfortable in imbalance, comfortable in roles, comfortable in the dynamics where one chases and the other retreats, where love is a pattern, not a presence. To engage with a woman who needs nothing, you must let die every version of you that was built on being needed. You must surrender the ego that says, I am only valuable if someone depends on me. You must stop performing and begin revealing. Begin existing. Begin showing up not with offerings, but with openness. Not with solutions, but with self. She does not want your sacrifices. She wants your truth. And truth is terrifying when you've spent your whole life hiding behind usefulness. This fear, this resistance, is not a sign that she is wrong for us. It is a sign that we are still hiding from ourselves, that we still equate worth with role connection, with control, and love with loss. She invites us to evolve past all of that. But evolution is painful. It asks for the death of the familiar self. It asks for us to let go of the image we've projected into the world, the strong one, the needed one, the one who always has it together. And in that empty space, we are forced to confront the question we've avoided our entire lives. Who am I if no one needs me? Who am I if I am not fixing, saving, proving, performing, and can I still be lovable? Then this is the shadow her presence casts, not because she is dark, but because she stands in light. And when someone stands in light, everyone else is forced to see their own darkness more clearly. She doesn't demand it. She doesn't even ask for it. She simply is. And that being whole, unbothered, untouched by need, burns through every false identity we've constructed. Not to shame us, but to liberate us. In truth, we don't fear her. We fear what she reflects. We fear the mirror she holds to our dependency, our unclaimed power, our still wounded ego. We fear the freedom she embodies because it means we could be free too. But only if we're willing to let go of everything that made us feel safe. And most of us aren't ready for that. Most of us would rather remain needed than become whole. But the cost of that choice is a life lived in roles, not in truth. A life where connection becomes survival, not sacredness. A life where we never really meet anyone because we've never really met ourselves. And so we push her away. We call her too much, too intense, too different. Not because she is, but because she reminds us of everything we still have not become. There's a silence that follows her absence. Not the silence of rejection, but the silence of truth. When she leaves, not out of anger, but from clarity, something inside you breaks. And it is not your heart. It is your illusion. The illusion that someone else could complete you. The illusion that love must be earned through sacrifice. The illusion that being needed is the same as being loved. In her absence, you are left with yourself. No one to impress. No one to save. No one to rescue you from your own reflection. Just you and the question that has been echoing since the moment you met her. Who are you without the role? Many spend their whole lives avoiding that question. They chase relationships, achievements, attention, even spiritual practices, not to grow, but to escape. They want to be wanted, needed, desired, adored. Because without those things, they fear they will vanish. But the woman who needs nothing does not vanish when she is alone. She becomes clearer, sharper, brighter. She does not dissolve into someone else's life to feel real. She carries her own, and when she walks away, it is not to punish. It is to protect her peace, because she has learned the hard way that peace is not something you find in someone else. It is something you guard within yourself. Jung wrote that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The woman who needs nothing is the living embodiment of that work. She has made her darkness conscious. She has faced it, sat with it, stayed through the long night without reaching for a distraction. And in doing so, she became whole. That wholeness cannot be faked. It cannot be borrowed. It cannot be imitated through aesthetics or trends. It can only be earned through solitude, through silence, through self-responsibility. And it is this quiet power that makes her so deeply unsettling to those who have avoided their own depth. We live in a world that rewards performance, where vulnerability is monetized and connection is curated. In this world, authenticity is rare, and someone who is genuinely whole, not performatively, but fundamentally feels alien, feels almost unreal. But she is real, and the discomfort she evokes is the most honest moment you've had in years. In a world of noise, her stillness is deafening. In a world of validation-seeking, her self-containment is blinding. She does not ask you to change. She does not beg you to rise. She simply leaves, and in doing so reveals how much of you was built on the presence of someone else's need. This is the reckoning. Not dramatic, not cruel, just honest. You realize you have built your identity not from self-knowledge, but from emotional transactions. You gave to be seen. You helped to be needed. You loved to be loved back. You played the part, the good one, the strong one, the loyal one. But you never really showed up, because you were always waiting for someone else to give you the permission to be. And she didn't give you that permission. She didn't give you anything. She just was. And that was the invitation to stop asking and start becoming. In this reckoning, you grieve. Not just her, but everything you abandoned in order to be accepted. You grieve the boy who wasn't taught how to be a man without proving himself. You grieve the girl who was told to be small so others wouldn't feel threatened. You grieve the years lost performing versions of yourself that were never real. And maybe for the first time, you realize that she was not rejecting you. She was showing you the path back to yourself. Nietzsche said, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. The woman who needs nothing has made peace with her chaos. She has danced through it. She no longer hides her fire. She no longer dims her light. She no longer rearranges herself to fit into rooms that were never built for her soul. And this freedom wild, unyielding, unapologetic is the future of love. Not love that clings, not love that demands, but love that invites. That says, I don't need you to complete me. I want you to walk with me. But I will walk alone if I must. This is not a tragedy. It is a rebirth. Because if you are willing to face the discomfort, if you are willing to let the false self die, you may just become someone who can meet her not from emptiness, but from essence. You may become someone who does not fear independence because you have found your own. Someone who does not resent boundaries because you have learned to hold your own. Someone who does not collapse in the face of solitude because you have learned to stand. And when that happens, when you too need nothing, then you will understand her. You will no longer feel threatened by her wholeness. You will honor it. You will mirror it. And you will love her not from a place of lack, but from abundance. Not from dependency, but from presence. This is the highest form of relationship, not need-based, not performance-based, but soul-based, built not on rescue but on recognition. But until that day comes, we will continue to fear her. We will continue to project onto her the parts of ourselves we have not owned. We will continue to try to make her small, so that we do not feel our own inadequacy. We will continue to label her control, her diminish her all, because we are not yet ready to meet her. Not because she is too much, but because we are still too little within ourselves. The woman who needs nothing is not asking for your fear. She is not asking for your worship. She is not asking for your validation. She is asking for nothing. And in that, she is asking for everything. She is asking you to become whole, to meet her in the place beyond need, the place beyond roles, the place where two souls can see each other clearly, without masks, without shame, without fear. And if you are not ready, she will walk away. Not as punishment, not to teach you a lesson, but because she has things to do, mountains to climb, oceans to swim, light to carry. She will walk away, and the silence she leaves behind will be your teacher, not to haunt you, but to awaken you. Because once you have seen her, you can never unsee her. Once you have stood in her presence, you can never return to your old shape. You will either rise to meet her or spend the rest of your life haunted by the echo of the woman who needed nothing and asked you to become everything. The woman who chose herself. There is a room inside every woman that no one speaks of. It is not the room of love, nor duty, nor longing. It is not where she keeps her dreams, or her laughter, or her plans for the future. It is older than that, quieter, more dangerous. It is the room where she waits for herself. And for most of her life, she never opens that door. She distracts herself with everything else, with being good, being beautiful, being needed, being chosen. She becomes what others praise and clings to what makes her acceptable. She becomes so skilled in meeting expectations that she forgets they were never hers to begin with. But the room doesn't vanish. It only grows heavier, louder, hungrier, and eventually something breaks. Maybe it's a betrayal. Maybe it's the unbearable repetition of being loved only for who she's not. Maybe it's just silence, a silence so deep it reveals that no one is truly coming for her. Not the lover, not the mother, not the world. And one day, she walks into the room. No one teaches a woman how to choose herself, because everything in society depends on her not doing it. Her worth has long been measured by how much of herself she can subtract, how much she gives sacrifices serves. The woman who chooses herself becomes a disruption to a system designed around her obedience. A woman who doesn't need approval is dangerous. A woman who says no without explanation becomes ungovernable. A woman who no longer fears abandonment because she has already walked through it becomes sovereign. And sovereignty terrifies people. Because we've been trained to believe that love must be earned, roles must be fulfilled, and identity must be borrowed, never forged. Most women are handed a script early in life: be wanted, be gentle, be small enough to fit into someone else's arms without making them uncomfortable. But the woman who chooses herself tears up that script and writes a new one in blood silence and the aching clarity of solitude. It doesn't happen all at once. Choosing herself is not an act of defiance, but an act of remembrance. She remembers who she was before the world taught her to forget. She remembers what it felt like to want something deeply and not apologize for it. She remembers what her voice sounded like before she softened it to make others stay. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But privilege is a misleading word here. For most, it is not a privilege. It is a wound that must be walked through barefoot. The woman who chooses herself does not do so because it is easy. She does so because every other choice has slowly bled her dry. There is something ancient in her rebellion. Not loud, not performative, not reckless, but sacred. She begins to reclaim what was hidden beneath politeness and self-denial. The wildness, the sharp perception, the rage that was never allowed to speak, the clarity that comes when you finally stop begging to be loved. And once she steps into that room, once she sits in the center of that quiet, unadorned self, she begins the most terrifying and liberating work of all. She stops waiting. She no longer waits for the phone to ring. She no longer waits for someone to notice the ache in her chest or the exhaustion behind her eyes. She no longer waits for the permission that never comes. She becomes the source. But here's what most don't understand. Choosing yourself isn't about isolation. It's about integration. It's not about rejecting others. It's about no longer rejecting yourself. It's about finally admitting the truth that's been whispering beneath the surface of every relationship, every job, every day spent pretending. The truth that nothing you give to others will ever be enough until you give yourself back to yourself. This is not a conclusion. This is not empowerment for the sake of a slogan. This is loss. Real loss. Because when a woman chooses herself, she inevitably loses what once kept her small. The relationships built on performance, the identities formed in reaction to others, the illusions of safety through conformity. She becomes the woman others don't recognize anymore. But maybe, for the first time, she does. To choose yourself is not to scream, but to go quiet, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of awakening. It is a silence that deafens every excuse, every justification, every inherited belief that once felt like law. In that stillness, she finally hears the voice beneath the performance, not the voice shaped to be palatable or safe, but the one that tells the truth. And often, it does not speak in words. It shows up as unease in her stomach when she's asked to be someone she's not, in the fatigue that follows, smiling through what exhausts her, in the guilt that surfaces after every yes she didn't mean. These aren't weaknesses. They are signal symptoms of the soul's revolt against a life that no longer fits. The reckoning is not glamorous. It comes slowly, sometimes painfully, as everything she built to survive begins to collapse. People leave. Roles dissolve. Familiarity rots. And beneath the wreckage stands a woman face to face, with a mirror she can no longer avoid. She sees now that the self she lived as the one who played nice, pleased everyone, stayed small, was not her truth, but her adaptation. Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But before she finds her why, she must first admit the unbearable truth that for most of her life, she was living someone else's. A mother's dream, a culture's ideal, a man's fantasy, a system's blueprint. And then comes the question, who am I when no one is watching? What do I believe when I stop being guided? What would I choose if I weren't afraid of being alone? And it is here in this quiet rebellion that the fear of aloneness begins to dissolve, not because others return, but because she does. Because loneliness is the ache of disconnection from the self, but solitude is the beginning of reunion. She starts to rewrite the myth. No longer the damsel, no longer the muse, no longer the mother who vanishes inside of others. She becomes something that has no word, because language was built for women who perform, not women who exist. She begins to integrate everything she was taught to deny her rage, her clarity, her longing, her disinterest in roles that mute her voice. Jung called this process individuation, the integration of the shadow, the instinct, the wholeness of being. And she lives it not as a theory, but as a necessity. She is no longer a fragment. She is the full form. And because of that, the world will resist her. She will be called selfish, cold, difficult. She will be misunderstood, pathologized, even feared, not because she is wrong, but because she is free. And still, she will not explain. She will not apologize for outgrowing their comfort. She lets them mourn who she used to be, knowing the version they miss was never truly her, it was the version they could use. But she no longer wishes to be used. She chooses discomfort over dishonesty, loss over illusion, depth over decoration. And most radically, she begins to ask what she wants, not what will make her likable, not what will keep her kept, but what stirs her soul, what pulls at her chest, what calls to her from beyond the noise. And when she answers that question honestly, she finds that the life she had no longer fits. That is the cost of choosing herself. It is the death of the false. But in that death, a strange peace begins to grow, not from certainty, but from alignment. She no longer performs safety. She becomes it. Not through control, but through presence. Not through perfection, but through truth. And this is how she begins to live, by no longer abandoning the knowing inside her. The woman who chooses herself enters a space that few speak of, and fewer survive intact the space where she must confront not only what she left behind, but what still lives inside her. Because even as she reclaims her truth, even as she steps out of old roles and patterns, the echoes remain. The conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. It lingers in subtle guilt, in sudden urges to please, in moments when her strength frightens even herself. And this is where the deeper work begins, not the external rebellion, but the internal reweaving of everything she thought she had to be. She must untangle her worth from sacrifice. She must separate love from servitude. She must face the internalized voice that still whispers she is too much, too wild, too selfish to be worthy of belonging. But instead of silencing that voice, she listens to it, not to obey it, but to understand it. Because that voice is not the enemy. It is the wounded protector she built to survive in a world that taught her to disappear. And now, instead of banishing it, she holds it close. She tells it we don't have to shrink anymore. We don't have to be chosen to matter. We don't have to earn rest or joy or breath. In that moment, she begins to mother herself, not in the way she was mothered, but in the way she always needed to be. With boundaries, with fire, with devotion. She becomes the guardian of her own becoming. And this is where the transformation takes root, not in the grand gesture, but in the ordinary choices made differently. She leaves the conversation when it drains her. She says no without apology. She chooses solitude not as a punishment, but as a sanctuary. She creates not to be seen, but because it brings her back to life. And little by little, a new self begins to emerge, not the woman who reacts, but the woman who responds. Not the woman who is shaped by the world, but the woman who shapes herself. She stops reaching for people who treat her like a performance. She no longer clings to what only feeds her fear of being alone. She lets the illusion fall of needing to be everything for everyone, of being the fixer, the healer, the emotional caretaker of others' comfort. And when she stops playing those roles, the silence returns. But this time, it does not haunt her. It holds her. It becomes a companion, a mirror, a home. She realizes she no longer needs to be saved, because she never needed saving, only space. Space to be all that she is without being punished for it. And with that realization, she reclaims something deeper than independence. She reclaims her belonging not to others, but to herself. The woman who chooses herself begins to walk through the world differently, not louder, not harder, but with a quiet force that unsettles everything built on her suppression. She becomes living proof that wholeness is possible without approval, that freedom is possible without rebellion, that love is possible without sacrifice. And though the path remains uncertain, She no longer fears the unknown because she has already faced the most terrifying thing of all, her own reflection. And she did not look away. There is a cost to choosing yourself that no one warns you about. It's not just the people you lose, the roles you release, or the illusions you shed. It's the identity that dies. The self you inhabited for years, maybe decades, becomes unrecognizable. And though you are becoming more whole, more honest, more awake, there is grief. Grief for the girl who tried so hard. Grief for the woman who twisted herself into something lovable. Grief for the years spent performing worthiness. It's a quiet mourning one without ceremony, but it's necessary. Because if you skip the mourning, you miss the wisdom. And this path, this fierce reclamation of the self, is nothing if not holy. You begin to understand that choosing yourself is not a one-time act. It is a daily devotion. 1,000 small choices to return to yourself when the world insists you abandon her. It is in how you speak to yourself in the dark. It is in how you hold your boundaries even when your voice shakes. It is in how you stop asking for permission to exist. You no longer contort for connection. You no longer bargain with your own integrity. And when someone says, "You've changed," you smile, because that is the point. You were not meant to remain a version of yourself that made others more comfortable. You were meant to evolve. You were meant to outgrow what no longer honors you. This is not arrogance. This is not rebellion. This is soul maturity. The quiet, grounded knowing that your life belongs to you. That your time is sacred. That your truth does not need validation to be real. And perhaps the most astonishing revelation comes not in a moment of triumph, but in the ordinary silence of being alone and feeling peace instead of panic. For the first time, you do not fear the absence of others, because you are no longer absent from yourself. You no longer run. You no longer chase. You no longer shape-shift. You rest. You root. You rise. And this still steady embodiment is what power truly looks like. Not the kind that dominates, but the kind that refuses to be diminished. And in your presence, others begin to remember something too. They remember their own wholeness, their own voice, their own capacity to choose differently. This is the legacy of the woman who chooses herself, not that she becomes worshipped, but that she becomes a mirror. A mirror that reflects back to others what they forgot they were allowed to be free. And if there is a final truth to speak, it is this: nothing is more dangerous to a world built on female compliance than a woman who is no longer waiting to be chosen. Because once she chooses herself, the game ends, and something older, deeper, truer begins. Not a performance, not a mask, but a life. One she no longer has to abandon herself to survive. She is not alone. She is awakened. It begins with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that lingers like smoke after something has burned. The kind of silence that wraps itself around you when you wake up and realize the life you were living wasn't really yours. She doesn't remember when it started, only that one day the mirror stopped lying. And in that reflection, she saw someone watching her. Not a stranger, not exactly. More like someone she'd buried. Someone ancient, someone patient, someone real. Most people think awakening is loud, explosive, divine. But for her, it came quietly. It was not a light descending from heaven. It was a question she could no longer ignore. Whose life am I living? And beneath that question, another one, sharper, more dangerous. Why did I forget myself for so long? She used to move through the world like a ghost in her own skin, smiling when she was supposed to, nodding when it made others comfortable, laughing just enough, caring just enough, giving just enough to be seen as good, but never enough to be seen as whole. People praised her for being selfless, but the truth was she had just been hollow. And hollow women are easy to shape, easy to please, easy to control, easy to forget. She was never taught to be real. She was taught to be good. And in this culture, being good often means being obedient, being pleasing, being silent. So she learned how to shrink, not by force, but by slow, invisible erosion, one compromise at a time, one apology at a time, one bite of her own tongue at a time. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." She had called it fate when she stayed in relationships that dulled her soul. She had called it love when she abandoned herself to earn someone else's presence. She had called it strength when she bore more than anyone asked her to carry. But now, as she stands on the threshold of her own awakening, she can see the truth. It was not fate. It was conditioning, psychological sleep. And somewhere in the dark, something had finally stirred. Awakening, contrary to what they tell you, is not comfortable. It is violent in its clarity. It is the breaking of glass between who you were told to be and who you actually are. It does not whisper. It roars, but only after it has been silent for far too long. It is not a moment of triumph. It is often a moment of collapse. She remembers the night she broke. Not in a way that destroyed her, but in a way that opened her. A sudden storm of grief and clarity rising in her chest, like a scream with no sound. It wasn't one thing that caused it, it was everything. The accumulated weight of years spent disconnected from her own center, from her intuition, from her truth. And that night, something ancient in her rose. It didn't ask permission. It didn't wait for approval. It simply rose. And when it did, it was not elegant. It was not soft. It was rage and sorrow and sacred fire, not aimed outward, but inward. At every moment she had betrayed herself to belong. At every time she had silenced her voice to be loved. At every mask she had worn until she forgot the feel of her own skin. In the firelight of that inner collapse, she met the woman she was meant to be. And the most terrifying part, that woman had been watching her all along. From the depths of the unconscious, from the corners of dreams, from the ache in her chest after every yes that should have been a no. She had been waiting, not to be rescued, but to be remembered. This is what they never tell you about awakening. It's not a grand ascent. It's a descent into everything you've buried to survive. The grief, the rage, the intuition, the power. You must go down into the underworld of yourself. You must confront the versions of you that played small to stay safe. The child who thought love meant disappearing. The teenager who learned silence was safer than truth. The woman who became a reflection of what others needed, never what she truly was. And when you meet them, you must not judge them. You must grieve for them. And then gently, you must let them go. The pain of awakening is not because you've become someone new. It's because you remember who you've always been. And once you remember, you cannot go back. She is not alone. She is surrounded by the fragments of herself, each piece humming with forgotten wisdom. She is not weak. She is simply carrying the weight of all the selves she has ever been. She is not broken. She is being unburied. And there is nothing more terrifying to the world than a woman who remembers herself. She begins to see through the roles. The daughter, the lover, the helper, the healer, the good girl, the ideal. All of them were clothes she had worn to be accepted in a world that never truly saw her. But now the seams are tearing. The fabric doesn't fit. The costume itches against her skin. Because awakening is not a new identity. It is the shedding of all false ones. And what remains beneath is not always immediately beautiful. It is raw, tender, wild, unshaped by the hands of culture. It is the self not polished for display, but pulsing with life. She remembers the moment she stopped apologizing for her depth, for the way she feels things too much, for the way her silences hold more truth than most conversations, for the way her presence unsettles people who are used to women who need permission. Her awakening did not make her louder, it made her clearer. And in that clarity, she saw what so many fear, that a woman who does not need to be needed cannot be controlled. That a woman who is not afraid to be alone is not afraid to leave. That a woman who has awakened to her own psyche is not looking for approval, she is looking for alignment. And alignment is dangerous to those who benefit from confusion. It terrifies the systems built on submission. It threatens the dynamics rooted in emotional dependency. When a woman stops fearing her own solitude, when she stops running from her inner voice, when she listens to the wisdom in her body and trusts the fire in her belly, she becomes untouchable, not because she is invincible, but because she is whole, and wholeness is no longer currency in a world addicted to brokenness. Nietzsche once wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." She has chaos, but now she understands it. It is not dysfunction. It is life refusing to be flattened. It is energy that was never allowed to move, emotion that was never allowed to speak. Her chaos is sacred, and in the stillness after the storm she feels something different. Not happiness, but depth. Not certainty, but truth. Not perfection, but presence. She no longer seeks to be loved for how well she fits the mold. She seeks to be seen in the full spectrum of her being, in her rage, her silence, her intellect, her sensuality, her intuition. She no longer flinches when someone walks away. She no longer begs for breadcrumbs of affection. She no longer shrinks in rooms that cannot hold her voice. She knows now what leaves was never hers. What stays must meet her where she stands, and where she stands is sacred ground. But the path to this place was not gentle. She had to die many times, not physically, but psychologically. She had to grieve who she thought she had to be. She had to let illusions burn until only ashes remained. And from those ashes, a woman emerged. Not a goddess, not a warrior, not a queen, just a woman fully awake, fully aware, fully human. She does not need to be worshipped. She needs to be respected. And she no longer trades her dignity for comfort. Her love is no longer transactional. It is sovereign. She loves from wholeness, not hunger. This is what makes her powerful. Not the way she speaks, but the way she sees. She sees through the mask you wear, through the words you don't say, through the fear behind your smile. And still she does not try to save you, because she knows now saving others is how she used to abandon herself. She does not play the rescuer anymore. She is done proving her worth through martyrdom. She has nothing to prove, nothing to earn, nothing to beg for. This is not a rebirth, it is a return to the self that existed before the world told her who she should be, to the knowing that was always there, buried beneath roles and rules, to the inner voice that whispered truths she wasn't ready to hear. Now she listens, not just with her ears, but with her whole being. She listens to her anger not as destruction, but as a signal. She listens to her grief not as weakness, but as devotion. She listens to her desires not as shame, but as direction. She is not alone, because the woman who is awake is never truly alone. She carries the echo of every woman who has walked this path before her. The women who were burned for their wisdom, silenced for their intuition, erased for their refusal to obey. She walks with them, and they walk with her, in dreams, in memory, in blood, in breath. The awakened woman is not one but many. She is an archetype, a force, a threshold, and to encounter her is to remember something ancient in yourself. She is not angry for no reason. She is not quiet out of submission. She is not fierce because she wants power. She is fierce because she remembers what it cost her to forget herself. And she will not pay that price again. Not for love, not for safety, not for peace. Because peace that requires self-betrayal is not peace, it is compliance. And her soul is done complying. She does not rage to destroy. She rages to purify. And from that fire, something cleaner arises. Something closer to truth. Something unshakable. She is not alone. She is awakened. And she is listening to the wind, to the pulse in her wrist, to the voice in her gut, to the dreams that speak in symbols to the body that has always known what the mind tried to forget. She is building a life that mirrors her soul, and it does not look like anyone else's, because it was never supposed to. There is a certain loneliness in awakening, not because she is truly alone, but because so many around her are still asleep. She walks through rooms where the conversation stays on the surface, where eyes avoid real seeing, where truth is dressed in polite avoidance. And she finds herself more silent now, not from fear, but from reverence. Because once you've touched your own soul, small talk feels like betrayal. She no longer needs to fill space with words. She is not performing clarity for others. She is holding it for herself. She has become a mirror, and mirrors unsettle those who are not ready to look. She remembers what it was like to try and explain herself, to give reasons for her boundaries, for her solitude, for the fire in her voice. But now she understands those who demand justification for her becoming are not meant to stand beside her in it. She doesn't owe anyone an explanation for her truth. Truth does not need defending. It only needs living. And when she lives it fully, the right people feel it not as a threat, but as an invitation to rise, to return, to remember. There is power in no longer needing to be understood. It liberates her from the cycle of shrinking, from over-explaining, from the exhausting hunger to be approved of. She no longer asks, "Do they like me?" She asks, "Is this true for me?" Because that is what awakening ultimately demands: radical loyalty to truth. Even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs relationships, even when it shatters old dreams, she would rather grieve what was false than live one more day inside a beautifully decorated lie. There's something else no one tells you about awakening. It doesn't make you more. It strips you of the excess, of the personas, the emotional camouflage, the borrowed beliefs. What remains is not louder, but quieter, not grander, but deeper, simpler. And in that simplicity, she finds a different kind of strength, a strength not born of defense, but of a presence, not needing to prove, just being, fully, without armor, without mask, without apology. Adler spoke of the deep human need to feel a sense of belonging. But what he also knew is that many people confuse belonging with fitting in. She no longer confuses the two. She understands now that true belonging only comes when she belongs to herself first. Anything less is exile, and she has exiled herself for far too long, smiling when she was suffocating, staying when her soul was begging to leave loving others while starving for her own touch. But now she reaches inward before she reaches outward. She asks, "What do I need?" And she listens not with guilt, but with reverence. She is not selfish, she is self-aware. And in a world that rewards self-abandonment in women, her self-awareness looks like rebellion. But she is not here to be palatable. She is not here to soothe the fragility of others. She is here to live awake, to move with clarity, to speak with truth, to burn what is false, and to love with integrity, not with fear, with depth, not with dependency, with openness, not with performance. Her love now is a reflection of her healing, not her wounds. There is a quiet fierceness in her now. She does not need to announce it. It speaks through her presence, through the way she enters a room with calm eyes and a grounded spine, through the way she says no, not with anger, but with certainty, through the way she doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't prove. She simply is. And that isness is a threat to everything built on manipulation, to every system that profits from female doubt, to every narrative that survives by keeping women small, unsure, divided. She is no longer seduced by chaos. She does not mistake drama for passion. She knows now what her nervous system feels like in peace, and she protects that peace like sacred ground. She walks away from what disturbs her inner quiet, not because she is fragile, but because she is wise. Healing taught her discernment. Awakening sharpened her intuition. She no longer second-guesses the knowing in her bones. If something feels off, it is. If someone cannot meet her emotionally, she stops lowering herself to meet them. If a space requires her to shrink, she leaves. This is not bitterness. This is boundaries. She does not close her heart. She closes the door to what dishonors it. She is not angry, she is awake. And there is a difference. Anger says, "I need you to change so I can feel safe." Awakening says, "I change my life so I can live in truth." She takes radical responsibility for her reality. She no longer waits for permission to live differently. She gives herself that permission now, and in doing so, she gives others permission too. She has become a signal, an invisible frequency that calls to other women who are quietly awakening. They may not speak it yet. They may still be afraid, but they feel it, in her presence, in her eyes, in her stillness, the echo of recognition. You too, she is not alone. She never was. Because something ancient is stirring in many, in whispers, in dreams, in grief, in longing, in rage. It is not a trend. It is not a phase. It is a remembering, a collective remembrance of what it means to be sovereign, not in domination, but in rootedness, not above others, but deeply within oneself, not separate, but individuated. Jung would call this the journey toward the self, the sacred process of becoming who you truly are beneath all masks and projections. And she is on that path now. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but fully. And that is more than enough. She no longer needs the world to reflect her value back to her, because she has seen herself. Not the self others constructed through projection, expectation, or need, but the self beneath all that. The one who survived. The one who watched from the shadows while she played the role. The one who whispered through every breakdown, "There is more than this." And she was right. There is more. Not more to achieve, not more to prove, but more to feel, more to know. more to become. Her awakening was not a lightning strike. It was a slow, deliberate burning, a fire lit inside her soul that refused to be extinguished. At first, it was small, just a flicker. But it grew. Every time she chose truth over comfort, it grew. Every time she honored her body's no, it grew. Every time she let something go that no longer mirrored her depth, it grew. And now that fire is no longer hidden. It burns through her words, her movements, her choices. It warms the spaces she enters and scorches the ones she leaves. Not out of destruction, but out of necessity. Because when you awaken, you realize that not everything is meant to come with you. She has outgrown much of what she once called home. Some friendships faded not from conflict, but from incompatibility. Some dreams dissolved not from failure, but from clarity. Some versions of herself died quietly in the night, mourned only by memory. And yet she does not feel empty. She feels clean, light, true. And in that truth, a different kind of life emerges not louder, but more alive. She no longer searches for meaning in external things. She no longer chases peak experiences to feel alive. Her life is not a highlight reel. It is a sacred ritual of presence, of deep seeing, of choosing what aligns even when it's inconvenient. She has replaced urgency with intention, numbness with embodiment, noise with silence. Her nervous system, once flooded with anxiety and overperformance, now moves to a slower rhythm. A rhythm that honors her limits, her energy, her soul. Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once said, "A man can do what he wants, but not want what he wants." But she has come to know herself so deeply that even her wants have been restructured. She no longer desires what wounds her. She no longer finds comfort in what distracts her. Her very longing has evolved. What she wants now is not more, but real, not praise, but peace, not validation, but resonance. She still feels fear, but it does not paralyze her. It guides her toward her edges where growth lives. She still feels sadness, but it is no longer weakness. It is proof of her humanity, of her capacity to feel the world deeply. She still feels desire, but it is no longer desperation. It is devotion to life, to truth, to the pulse of her own becoming. She is not above the world. She is rooted in it now, but on her terms, through her eyes, in her integrity. And this is the quiet reckoning. Not everything changes. The world still spins in its madness. People still wear masks. Systems still reward performance over presence. But she changes. And because she does, everything she touches changes too. Her relationships are fewer, but deeper. Her choices are quieter, but more honest. Her path is narrower, but far more sacred. She no longer needs to be everything. She only needs to be herself, fully, consistently, unapologetically. The awakened woman does not walk around declaring her awakening. She doesn't need to. Her life speaks for her. Her boundaries speak for her. Her peace speaks for her. Her presence, calm, grounded, unshakable, speaks louder than any philosophy ever could. She doesn't argue with those who misunderstand her. She doesn't convince anyone to stay. She simply lives. And in that living, she gives others a blueprint for something more real. She is not here to be adored. She is here to be whole. She is not here to be a savior. She is here to be sovereign. She is not here to play a role. She is here to live the truth that was buried in her bones before the world told her who to be. And now that truth rises in her like a wave. Steady, unstoppable, ancient, sacred. She is not alone. She is part of a silent rising, a remembering, a return. You may not see it on the surface, but it is happening in therapy rooms and journals, in whispered prayers and solitary walks in breakups that look like breakdowns but are really breakthroughs. She is everywhere now. Not because she wants attention, but because her energy can no longer be denied. You may not recognize her at first, but you will feel her. In her eyes, in her stillness, in the quiet certainty that radiates from a woman who has faced herself and lived to tell the story. She is not alone. She is awakened. And she is watching not with judgment, but with knowing, because she remembers what it was like to forget. She remembers the ache of being disconnected from herself. And so when she meets another woman still in the fog, she does not preach. She does not push. She simply holds her gaze and whispers, "You're not crazy. You're waking up." And in that moment, something ancient stirs again. The chain is unbroken. The awakening continues. And the world, though it may not see it yet, is being quietly rewritten by women who have returned to themselves.